Thank you for joining us today. Today we are here to talk about binding tokens and the identity proofing that goes into that. I'm Ryan Alexander, VP of Identity here at Prove, background in financial services with a focus on authentication, fraud prevention, and looking forward to today's discussion. Bill?
Yeah, and I'm Bill Fish, so I'm the VP of Authentication Products here at Prove. I have a telco background, and I'm also looking forward to the discussion today. So, kicking it off, we're going to talk through kind of four key items. The first is, why is identity important to the success of FIDO? I think this is a topic that, we all have spent a lot of time ruminating about over the particularly last few years. We're also going to talk about why we believe that mobile is the best bridge between the physical and the digital worlds, as well as some best practices around the binding of a FIDO credential, and importantly, the revocation of FIDO keys as well. So we'll get into all of that throughout the presentation.
And no FIDO conference, identity and authentication conference, is complete without starting with the standard Peter Steiner cartoon. On the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog, and 30 years later, FIDO is not just a dog anymore. We are making great strides in authentication, and we're getting better at solving the identity, but I think we still have a ways to go on that. And if we were also, relying on FIDO tokens to authenticate someone going forward, it's really important to get the identity right the first time, because, if we were to show this cartoon today, it might say on the internet, you just have to fool them once that you're not a dog. So it's really important to get the identity right, because, as strong as FIDO is, and that we all believe in that, if you don't get it right the first time, you can fool them once and then just present that FIDO token as someone else ongoing, and then you're relying on a token that is perhaps a synthetic identity or something else.
Yeah, so what that really means then in this, kind of coming off the back of fool them once, is this cycle of identity and authentication. Identity and authentication really go hand in hand. Having one without the other doesn't really solve the problem. This is the customer journey, if you will. So you really need to have a strong identity resolution and verification up front. But what that allows you to do then, and what you want to do, is you want to establish authentication credentials as closely as you can to the identity verification event, because as we all know, authentication is essentially having a user verify that they are still the same person that they were, particularly in an identity verification scenario. So what we do, and this is why we are all at the Authenticate conference, is we want to issue credentials and tokens, particularly cryptographic keys that can be replayed to represent the user in ongoing authentication scenarios. It's that establishment of the credentials off the back of that identity verification. And that handles all your sunny day, happy path scenarios, all the improved UX and that we all love, and that we are here to talk about generally at the FIDO conference. But that's all built off the back of a strong identity verification and resolution foundation. But what happens is when you have the authentication tokens, right, there's always going to come a moment that you need to handle, which hopefully it's an edge case, but it's an important edge case to cover, is account recovery. So what happens when, I drop my phone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, or maybe I just want to upgrade to a new device? And there are ways to bootstrap a new device off of an existing trusted device, and that helps smooth that transition. But when you talk about going back down that funnel, right, you need to have at the bottom of that the ability for a user to essentially re-identify themselves, to have another identity verification event.
Yeah, and it really starts with solving identity. Now, typically, we've seen various methods to do this in the past, historically, and we are getting improvements to that in the future. And but historically, like right now, the FIDO, what we all believe in is this cryptographic key that we can authenticate that user. We all have confidence in that cryptographic key. You start to see shifts in more things are going to this cryptographic key to provide assurance that it's really this person doing this transactions. You see that with the EMV chip and debit cards. Historically, like carriers have always authenticated their callers with a SIM cryptographic key. So there's a lot more that we should be relying on in the identity space around cryptographic keys to identity proof that person, just as we all believe in the FIDO cryptographic key of ongoing authentication, that presenting that person as still who they say they were originally at the bind. So this identity resolution piece is really important. There's a lot that goes into it. You want to be using cryptographic keys and fraud prevention, but it all starts with the bind and that initial getting that identity right at the first point. Typically where IDV solutions come up short is, in the age of like data breaches, we're asking questions that have commonly been breached, or there are solutions out there. Well, they'll just validate the PII information that it's really Ryan, his SSN, his birth date, and his address, but they don't go the next step to actually authenticate the person behind the computer or the transaction that's actually doing that. Now, is it really Ryan that's presenting Ryan's information? So some solutions will fall short in just validating the PII information. I've also been challenged with some sales teams in the past where they will say, let's just open the account and we'll rely on downstream controls to solve it. Where if you rely on downstream controls, it's not going to catch some of the fraud that you got wrong at the very beginning. So it's really important to get it right the first time. Especially, there's also things like making sure that you're not proofing a synthetic identity, making sure there's enough fraud detection, anomaly detections, having enough layered security. And lastly, I'll say that, you don't want to be reliant on a risk-based solution where it's a probabilistic choice, that you want to be relying on this cryptographic, deterministic. Is it really that phone or that debit card with the EMV chip, or is it some reliable token that you can rely on, that it's solely that possession? So this is typically where these IDV solutions come up short.
So how do you address that? What do you do when you're relying on solutions that you feel like are coming up short? They aren't addressing the real problem. You're just verifying PII, but not who's presenting behind the scenes. And that's where this device in particular is the bridge between the digital and the physical worlds. And we all know this. That's why, for example, SMS OTP has proliferated so widely, is because you can have confidence that somebody can receive it, right? It's relatively ubiquitous. Even in terms of from a smartphone standpoint, the adoption of smartphones has gotten up to over 85% of adults in the U.S. You can also know that, and I thought this was interesting, having kids myself, that 11 and 12 years old is the average age for the first phone in the U.S. So by the time they're going to become a user, is going to likely become a customer of yours, they've had their phone and their phone number for quite a while, right? Also importantly, Americans check their phone 96 times a day, right? Which tells me that this thing is near me all the time. And I can sadly verify that personally, that I do check my phone much more than I would like to. But when was the last time your phone was outside of maybe 6 feet away from you? Not very often. So as a piece of hardware that is connected to an individual, it's one of the best things that you're gonna have. And Ryan touched on this earlier. It's based on particularly the possession of the phone number is based on a cryptographic connection between the mobile device and particularly the SIM card and the mobile carrier, right? That connectivity allows data to be routed to the phone. It allows communications, your phone calls, your text messages to arrive at your phone, which is kind of the magic of the mobile network. So all that being said, the underlying premise is, okay, this thing is the best bridge, but there are challenges associated with that. There are limitations, if you will, which is why you don't want to just prove possession of a single device in isolation. So what that means is you need to take a comprehensive approach to having a more deterministic authentication experience. So it's not just about me proving that I have this phone number, although that is an excellent start, right? As I can prove that I possess 555-1212. I can receive a message to my phone. There are network signals that you can check to say, okay, is the data actually going to the device that possesses 555-1212? And that's really the anchor, is to say, okay, that user is validly presenting that they possess 555-1212. And then
on top of that, you can then check the reputation and the ownership of that phone number. So for example, making sure that if you're going to rely on that SIM card, that cryptographic key authentication of the possession check, that you're authenticating that to a phone that hasn't been, recently SIM swapped or ported, or doesn't have, suspicious activity. It's not short tenure. And as well, that you're verifying the ownership of that SIM, that it's really Bill Fish, his phone, that is actually the owner of this SIM card and that phone number. So, in a single statement, you're verifying with a text message or a passive check of the possession, sending a text message to Bill's phone that hasn't been taken over as one event. And that's one very strong way with using a cryptographic key to authenticate, your end user. And one thing I'll mention on the RBA, I found a very interesting story, said that, in the carrier world, for example, if the carriers relied on an RBA solution, every time you placed a call, the carrier could make a risk assessment on your call. And they might say, oh, well, this may not be the person making that phone call, so we're just not going to connect that call. The end user would say, no, connect my call. This is me, I'm making this call. So the carriers have relied on this cryptographic key to connect those calls. And as long as they have that cryptographic key, they're connecting those calls regardless. There is no risk-based assessment on whether they connect that call or not. So I found that story very interesting and relevant to the authentication and verification of people using the phone number.
Yeah, and that's actually really important to put these things together. And I think that's reiterating the statement. It's like, yes, a cryptographic key using the phone number is a great starting point. You have to pair that with a check of the reputation and make sure. We all know that and that I don't think this is news to anybody, that SMS in particular is susceptible to takeover via a remote attack, right? So you've got to have reputation attached to it, particularly when you're talking about identity verification. That's tied to that.
And I'll just add on to that real quick. I mean, sure. Everyone knows that SMS authentication is not something that we all want to rely on ongoing. I think that's why we're here at the FIDO conference. We believe in the cryptographic ongoing authentication here, but it's really all about that bind and making sure that you get the right person at the very first step. And there's multiple ways to do that. And we think that this cryptographic key, relying on the possession, reputation, and the ownership, is one strong way to do that bind. And we can go into some of the checklists of the best practices for bindings. I think if we were to advise, or some of the things that we look at when best practices for binding, what you would want to do is start simple. When you're trying to identity proof the person, you want to start simple, make it easy, get as much as you can passively. Once you bind, monitor to increase trust over time, and then add friction and factors when the transaction risk warrants it. We'll get into more of these on each of the slides going forward.
So the first thing you want to do is, like Ryan said, you want to start small, make it simple. One of the challenges that I think a lot of identity verification flows make is users will fall out of processes very easily, particularly if they, any friction is a risk for losing that customer during that flow. There's a very low tolerance in many scenarios, unless you're handing out gold bars, right? They're not going to complete. 100% of your customers are not going to complete the process. So just start small. So conduct a possession check to the mobile phone. Establish that, hey, this customer is contactable. They can receive the communication that is intended for that phone number. Having a good working phone number, it really does force bad actors to cycle through different numbers, or essentially preventing. It makes it more difficult to scale attacks. Let's put it that way.
Yep.
You end up having cryptographic confidence that connectivity is based on that key being able to communicate with the mobile network. So there's a high level of confidence in that initial starting point. Again, it's a starting point, right? And that foundation, once you've established that the user possesses the phone number, then you can do risk assessment around its use as an authenticator. Now, remember that the text messages, particularly, that was built as a communication channel. That wasn't built as an authentication channel, right? It was like, how do I quickly and easily get a message to my friends or to my mom or whomever, right? It wasn't built with authentication in mind, but with the possession of the phone number as a foundation, we can use other signals then to establish risk around its use as an authenticator.
Step 2, I would say get as much as you can passively. So one of the ways we can do the text message to the phone as a possession check. You can also do this passively through like a secure handshake from the device to the carrier through the cell tower signal. So there's ways to do this passively that avoid the friction, and it's actually more secure because there is no 6-digit code that can be socially engineered out of the customer's message, and so it's actually it's even more secure. You can also check the reputation passively, and all the ownership of these phones, so that when you're sending that text message, these other checks are just done passively, and you don't have to friction the customer by making them slow down their application, whatever transaction they're doing. And the more you can also do passively is check fraud signals. So for example, in the possession check, for example, you can make sure that the text message was sent. They're actually clicking a link. We have this instant link that you can send to the phone, and if they click the link from the phone that it was actually sent to, is one check that you can do passively. Another one is where, if they're requesting the OTP on a laptop in California from that IP address, and they're clicking the link from a phone that's located in Florida, for example, those can be checked passively. So you can be doing a lot of additional fraud checks passively to, either provide assurance or slow down the transaction.
Yeah, and I think an important point attached to that too is this: a lot of times we have this concept that in order to have a more secure experience, you need to add friction, make the user do something. Well, there's an inverse to that too, which is problematic. Every time you get the user to do something, you're providing an opportunity for a fraudster to socially engineer that situation, right? So that's why getting as much as you can passively is so important. It happens without the user necessarily engaging in a specific activity that can be directed by a fraudster via social engineering.
Thirdly, you can once you establish that bind and say you got a good confidence that it's the person, you should be monitoring to increase that trust over time, and you can be looking at things of tenure to increase that trust. Are they doing transactions of equal size value? And that can that heartbeat of transactions and tenure gives you more confidence that it's really that person, because a fraudster would have to impersonate someone for a long time to then, subvert an identity. If there's no fraud reported on that for a long tenure, again, that's another thing. And then also looking to assess the changes on that device. So is there something, and we'll talk about this, I think, in some future slides here, but just looking at environmental signals that can assess if something risky has changed about that device. So monitoring to increase that trust.
And then I think it's important as well as when the transaction risk level increases, that should be the determining factor as to when you increase friction for your users. As I was saying earlier, right? You want to minimize the use of those frictionful moments because they can be targets of social engineering. But when the transaction risk warrants it, you can do all that passively, but then also step up your user in those certain circumstances. And there are a few ways that you can do that. You can do that through, things like government ID scans that proves that you possess a different piece of proof that I am me. You can add in as something that private, changeable key. Things like social security number, birth date are not those things. Those things can be easily phished, but if a user can have control over that shared secret. Also, obviously, something you are. A lot of the FIDO flows that you see are built off of this premise of using biometrics that are available on different devices in different scenarios. So that's sort of highly recommended to add friction when risk warrants it. And then you can also have a second possession check, potentially recognizing that is not part of a traditional multi-factor. You want to have something something you have, something you are. But if you have concerns about the possession of one particular factor, you can also say, well, do you have that other thing that is registered as a credential for you?
And I'll say, friction isn't necessarily a bad thing in some scenarios. For example, like if you're going to prevent someone from doing a digital wire, a high dollar wire or money movement transfer online, and you're going to force that person to either wait in a contact center queue for 45 minutes, or they have to drive in 40 miles to the local branch to do X, Y, or Z. Doing a doc scan or adding some minimal friction to avoid a longer frictionful thing, or a possible interruption of that transaction is not the worst scenario too. So I think in some cases you need to balance friction with the alternative, which could be a longer or broken, interrupted customer experience.
Yeah, maybe add a little bit of friction to avoid a lot of friction in the long run.
That's right.
So once you've established your cryptographic key, you've gone through this process of starting simple, of monitoring for trust and adding friction when necessary. We do need to talk about, well, when do I no longer trust a particular key for authentication, right? And the reason why this is important on the identity verification side is this re-kicks off, I should say, the identity verification process. So it's important to know, like, what rises to the level where I need to go through this stronger process again. So the first thing you want to look for is, when do device characteristics change? Those device characteristics that particularly point to a compromising of the underlying key, right? So those could be, is the device itself jailbroken? Then maybe you don't rely on that underlying key. They added new biometrics, so maybe you want them to re-enroll. Or if there are changes to an existing SIM key, so it goes inactive, it may indicate the phone was lost or stolen. This is kind of the first thing, and it's hopefully the most obvious thing that you would look for to say, okay, I need to force my user back through an account recovery process.
And also, other things that should point back to an identity proofing where they should be revoking keys is situations where the customer knowingly either lost or has their device stolen. They should be able to notify the business, and the business should be able to revoke those keys. In some cases, I've seen a FIDO, a token, or a biometric is really just a replacement for inputting of a username and password in some of the apps. And so if you rely on that FIDO token to as an insertion of the username and password, and the password changes, you want to revoke that key that's asserting that username and password too. So those are that's another attempt or another case where you'd want to revoke that password or revoke the key. And then also if there are new, like a fraudster attempts to, bind a new device, but a legitimate person is already using and they have their device and they haven't lost it and they want to still use it, there should be notifications around, unauthorized attempts to bind and even requests done to the existing device. And then lastly, like if a customer knowingly, gets a new phone, they should have the option to revoke their keys as well.
So all that to say, we love FIDO. We love the experience, the benefits that you get, the security benefits that you get, the happy path, sunny day scenarios are awesome. And once you establish those tokens, I think you'll see a ton of benefits to that. But what you don't want to do is in the race, I would say, to deploy those best in class authenticators, don't forget to make sure you know who's behind them. Identity verification is the starting point for a customer's digital journey in the identity authentication space. Like, how do you service them going forward? So it's really important to do that process really well up front, leveraging the thing that everybody has closest to them, which is their mobile phone, and applying that possession, that reputation, that ownership. So you have a high level of confidence that not only does Bill possess this phone, but it's actually Bill's phone behind it, that identity verification, and it can be done seamlessly, relatively painlessly, and in ways that are not onerous to customers.
And I'll just add one last point too, that, not relying on the risk-based authentication methods, but relying on cryptographic keys that can help you assert that identity in a deterministic way is a stronger method to those identity proofing processes. But again, a lot goes into those identity proofing processes. Layered security is very important. The fraud checks and anomaly detections is helpful. And using the methods that we just laid out is the best structure for binding. But we thank you for your listening today, and we appreciate getting to meet many of you at the conference here shortly. And we hope you all enjoy your time at the conference.
Yeah, thank you so much.